start in about 2 minutes. Thank you so much. To a table that has a few people on it already.
Let me know.
Let me also say that we do have simultaneous interpretation, and all of the equipment is right there to my left. Tenemos interpretación en español. Si necesitan los dispositivos, están allí a la izquierda en la entrada, así que pueden ir allá y participar en esta conversación. My name is Nancy Navarro. I'm the president of the Montgomery County Council, and I have the privilege to serve with an incredible group of amazing public servants. Today we have Vice President Katz here. And where is Sydney? There he is. Councilmember Evan Glass is here as well. He's an at-large member. And we also have Councilmember Gabe Albornoz, who's also an at-large member. And my understanding is that Councilmember Duanda will be joining us soon. We also have Board of Education member Carla Silvestri. Thank you, Carla, for being here as well. And of course, all of you who are VIP, and really do appreciate all of you being here. So very quickly, I just want to start, of course, thanking the amazing Department of Recreation, Portia, who does an amazing job as directing this White Oak Vacation Center, and serves her a round of applause. It's really great. Her energy is obviously, the minute you walk into this facility, you feel it, and really do appreciate your leadership. the East County Regional Services Center, which is led by J. Rube Mande, who is another amazing and dynamic leader, help coordinate this. Of course, our Public Information Office, Leadership Montgomery, and we have Ms. Marie Taylor. You'll hear from her very soon, but really appreciate everything that she does for our county, and Tiffany Ward, as well as Dr. Elaine Bonner-Tompkins, who have teamed up as a dynamic duo to get us through all of this extraordinary work. I really appreciate all that they're doing. So this is our third county-sponsored conversation, although MCPS did host a youth conversation, and it's really exciting to really take the time to get into a space where we can have this important conversation. And this is not just about, sharing, which is very important, or venting, which is very important, but this is about giving us feedback as we will start to work on drafting legislation to then establish a racial equity and social justice policy in the county. So all of this will be feedback incorporated into that, along with the research that we have done. And of course, once we introduce the piece of legislation, then we will have our usual process of having a public hearing, so we can hear more input, and then committee work sessions, and then we will adopt the legislation. My goal is for us to adopt legislation by the end of fall with an effective date of January 2020. So this is part of that process. But let's take a step back to talk a little bit about why now and why are we here. So this illustration, and I'm sure you've seen different iterations of this illustration, but I think it is important in a very nice way of visually capturing what we're trying to do here, right? I think that for a long time, many of us in public office really have been working so diligently to eliminate many disparities. And of course, what we can do is pass legislation, adopt policies, as well as adopt budgets. But oftentimes, there's confusion around what is the strategy. So some folks think that it's about equality, kind of like everybody gets the same thing, and then we'll be fine. And we all know that that is not what will get us to a point of eliminating these disparities, because there have been so many historic forces and so many policies that have led us to this moment in time. And therefore, just giving everybody the same means that you are ignoring the fact that there were some groups who have not had the same advantages and the same privileges as others. That doesn't work. And so then we talk about equity, and I think that's the second piece, is where you start realizing that yes, we need to accept and we need to understand that there are going to be certain groups and there's going to be certain communities that are going to need a little bit more. Maybe strategically we begin investing there when we roll out an initiative. There are ways that we can be more strategic to achieve that. But ultimately what we want to do is get to what's called liberation. And there's the last one, which is that these disparities, which I think are signified with this wall, they need to disappear. I mean, that is really our ultimate goal. That is, where we want to aspire to be as a community. But obviously, we are not confused about the fact that this is not an easy task, because it's taken centuries for us to be where we are. But I tend to say that I'm an irrational optimist, and I think that we always have an opportunity every single day when we wake up to begin to work on major structural changes, and so that's what we're doing this year. So for me, this issue of disparities, I've always thought about them as a socioeconomic imperative of our time. I had the privilege to serve under President Obama at the White House in a commission looking at issues on education for Latinos, and I served in the early education subgroup. And one of my biggest takeaways was this notion that we need to begin to reframe our narrative, because many times when we talk about racial equity or social justice, when we talk about early childhood, when we talk about academic achievement gap, etc., people tend to automatically think that this is only a moral issue or only a civil rights issue. But we need to also begin to acknowledge that this is definitely a social economic imperative. Because there is no way that with a demographic in our nation that is getting older and a younger demographic that can be our labor force, but happens to be majority of color, there is no way that we're going to be able to continue to have the kind of economic vitality if we don't begin to dismantle all of these structural barriers for so many in our county and in our country. So we know that our population is growing both in numbers and in diversity, and we all know that this didn't happen overnight. We continue to work on trying to eliminate these disparities, but they are persistent, and I began serving on the Board of Education in 2004, and what motivated me to serve was the notion that, I have sort of a front seat to a lot of these concerns and these issues, having been born and raised in Venezuela, coming from a mixed race family, which is kind of a new term for us, because I think everybody in Venezuela is mixed race. Married a Haitian, a Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean man, and have two adorable, amazing Black, Afro-Latina Black daughters. I had to truly take a front seat to figure all these things out, to be the best advocate I could be for my children, but also for many in this county. And that's what propelled me to run for the Board of Education in 2004. And that's when I began to think about this equity policy. As a matter of fact, I had started to do work on that before I ran for the council. But to be honest, we've done so much. We've adopted so many strategic plans and, really adopted so many initiatives. And this academic achievement gap continues to be a challenge, right? The opportunity gap that leads to an academic achievement gap continues to be a challenge. So it's obvious that these disparities are institutional and systemic in nature. And that is why we have to put in place structural changes. Addressing issues of racial equity are a must, again, if we are to ensure the continued socioeconomic vitality of our county, but quite frankly, of our country as well. So a very quick snapshot of the changes, or the changes in the county in terms of demographics in our current state. As you can see here, you have the current Montgomery County demographics, and you see that in order for us to succeed with this policy, we are not going to be able to do this in a binary fashion, right? It cannot be, well, let's just look at white versus Latino, or white versus Black, or white versus Asian, because we are a county that in many ways reflects the makeup of this country and the nation. And so we're going to have to dig very deep into many of the issues that affect each and every one of these communities if we're going to succeed here in the county in eliminating all of these disparities. As you see, our county became majority people of color in 2010. And so, at CPS, you start seeing also, of course, similar demographic changes, because that is really the epicenter of all the changes in our community. But MCPS became majority students of color in 2000. And when you see the breakdown, it's very clear that the future of this county really is this extraordinary diverse place where we are extremely fortunate to be home to so many and really be such a welcoming county. But if you look at the graph, the next slide, you see the shifts, right? And so you see that from 1980 to 2017, I mean, it's incredible when you see the changes, right? Look at the number, for example, the percentage for Black residents. From that time period, it grew by 310.9%. Latino residents grew a whopping 810.6%, and Asians 629.6%. So I wanted to show that because I still to this day hear people talk about, like, oh, the changes in demographics in the county, like this just happened like last month. And it has not. This has been happening for a very long time. And even though we have a lot of challenges in our county and we are not shy about talking about those challenges, this is a pretty amazing place to live. And so it right there also rejects that notion and that stereotype that, oh, if you have a very diverse community, you might have issues, of quality of life and education quality and all that. I mean, look, we have been experiencing all of these demographic changes for quite a long time. And CPS, from 2002 to 2018, you see there as well the changes in our school system. And once again, they're pretty dramatic changes, but again, this didn't happen overnight. And so this is another reason why we need to begin to also change the way that we frame our narrative, right? This is no longer about, oh, we have to do a special program for our African American students or our Black students or Latino students. It has to be special, it has to be targeted. What I always say is, we need to flip that. The reality is that this is who we are. This is our student population. These are our residents. We no longer should be talking about it as if they are niche pockets of population in our county. There is a real cost to disparities. We all know this, I think, anecdotally, of course, and personally, many of us understand this, but there has been a lot of research that, of course, shows that closing these disparities really do have, a positive impact, and not doing anything has major cost. And I think it was very interesting, this Policy Links Equitable Growth Profile for Fairfax County that estimated that eliminated income disparities by race and ethnicity would have increased their GDP by $26.2 billion. So even, those of us that care a lot about economic justice and, we pass minimum wage here and all of that, well, this is also very important. Because yes, our low-income residents, appreciate things like raising the minimum wage and everything that we do. What they would appreciate the most is having access to good-paying jobs with benefits. What they would appreciate most, especially in this part of the county, in the East County, are job centers where our young people can have access to internships and then really good jobs. So that's why this issue of economic strategies are so important as we frame the narrative for these conversations. And by the way, Fairfax County adopted a policy. That's why they have this type of research. Hopefully we can do something similar here very soon. So very quickly, because I've gotten a lot of questions, either from the media about, well, when is the policy, what's happening, and when's that going to happen? And let me just share that for me it was really important for us to take our time, because these are issues that are very complex in nature. And to just rush and draft legislation, which I undoubtedly could do, I thought it was important for us to take our time. Last year, the entire council unanimously adopted a resolution affirming our commitment to adopting a policy on racial equity and social justice. And then in September 2018, our amazing Office of Legislative Oversight produced a report, Racial Equity in Government Decision-Making, Lessons from the Field, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel, we want to learn about what's happening in other jurisdictions. This January, it was amazing, we hosted a two-day training led by the Racial Equity Institute. And we gathered at Brookside Gardens over 40 leaders, Montgomery County leaders, and the entire council, County Executive Elrich, the superintendent, the president of the college, the chair of park and planning, all these folks were there. And we spent 2 days going through this very important workshop to set the tone for the work that we were going to engage this year. Then in February, we also did a racial equity training debrief with Leadership Montgomery, which was very important. And we kicked everything off on March 13th with a press conference, and then we had our first community forum. That was at Silver Spring at the Civic Center. We've also had other community engagement opportunities. MCBS hosted a really amazing student forum. We also had a county community conversation. This was at Black Rock Center of the Arts in Germantown. Of course, we're here today. Mana Food, Grace Episcopal Church, Kingdom Fellowship AME Church, and NAACP, Interfaith Works, among others, have also hosted different conversations. So the idea is that, we developed a toolkit, which everybody hopefully has one and has one at the table. You can host your own community conversation. You can do it with your family, you can do it in your neighborhood, you can do it in your temple, synagogue, church, wherever. You can host your own. And then what we do ask is that you send us the feedback so that we can incorporate it, as I mentioned earlier, in the drafting of our legislation. We wish we had time and resources to host these like every week, but we don't. And that's why we want to empower everybody to host their own conversations using the toolkit. Finally, we've received also already a briefing on a baseline report. I felt it would be critical for us to have a baseline report so that we could then continually target ourselves to see how we are achieving our stated goals. It's all about outcomes. You'll see a couple of those slides from that report. And then pretty soon, I would say, beginning in a couple of weeks, and then picking that up again in the fall, we'll start drafting legislation, and then we'll go through that process. So that is the timeline. And once again, I just felt that it was important not to rush through this and do this, in a deliberative fashion. And so that's what we're doing. So I just really appreciate everyone being here. I want to acknowledge that my colleague, Councilmember Hans Reamer, is here as well. He's an at-large member. He's back here. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to our County Executive, Marc Elrich. This has been a truly cooperative process, and we would not be able to succeed unless we do this collaboratively with you, with the council, with the executive, and all our partners. So I really do appreciate that cooperation.
So thank everybody for coming out tonight. All of these events have had really, really strong attendance, and it's good to see this much interest in the community in this kind of discussion. It's not always an easy discussion, because in fact we've been able to consistently turn out groups of people who want to talk about it. I feel is a good statement about where we're starting from. Like Nancy said, we kind of started this process last year with a resolution saying that the council would adopt and the county would adopt racial equity lens programs in the coming year. And I've been working on this, I guess, in our own right on the executive branch. We are recruiting for a director on racial equity programs. And our ultimate goal is we have to both train our staff and then train trainers. We have thousands of employees in Montgomery County, and we need to train our staff by creating a group of trainers who can then go through the departments and work with people in the departments. When I think about the racial equity, I think about all these issues are important. One of the things we're dealing with, and it goes beyond the traditional definitions of equity and program equality, and that is a special focus on the condition of African Americans in Montgomery County, because this is something that has defied 300, 400 years of American history in terms of being able to get this right. And this country has absolutely refused to deal with the Civil War, to deal with the legacy of the Civil War. Other countries have reconciliation commissions to try to come to terms with things. Other countries talk about reparations and what you need to do to undo the damage that was done. And America manages to have a massive case of amnesia and skip over this. And so one of the things that's motivated me most is not skipping over this anymore. It's time for this to come to an end, and we have to come to grips with racism in this country, and particularly the effect on the African American community, because it's not going to fix itself. And I tell people about two things I took away from the movie about James Baldwin, I'm Not Your Negro. If you have not seen it, you should go see it. There's a scene of Dr. King in about 1964-65. He's in Congress. Somebody comes up to him, a reporter, and is talking about, the difficulty getting civil rights legislation through Congress. And King's answer was, they want us to wait another 40 years. Well, that was 1964, and I'm sitting in the movie theater for 65, and I added 40. And we're actually 40, 50, 60 plus years beyond that point. And I'll just say, if you're going to wait for white people to get ready to access racial equality on their own, you will wait forever. And you cannot defer justice until people are ready to accept it. You have to take a different approach. We've got to be willing to deal with these problems, not when everybody's comfortable. We needed to deal with them a long time ago. We need to deal with them now, not continue to defer this. So, listening to King say that was just kind of shocking. at the moment. I remember those days because I was involved in the civil rights stuff. When I was at the University of Maryland, I was involved in efforts to integrate the campus there, where when I started school at Maryland, no business in College Park and no apartment in College Park were going to a black person. And all the kids were steered to the other schools in the university system because they weren't going to have them in College Park. And that's the world I came out of. And it's not a world that's moved a whole lot since then. And we gotta do things about that. The other thing in the movie that struck me was at the end of the movie, they're interviewing Baldwin, and the reporter kind of says, so what are we gonna do about the Negro problem? Something like that. And Baldwin says, it's not a Negro problem, it's a white problem. I said, no matter what black people do, no matter what education you get, no matter what car you drive, no matter how many dollars you got in your pocket, no matter what you do, that does not change the perception of white America. And so if it was their problem, they could fix it. God knows people have done everything you could possibly do to fix it, but it doesn't get fixed. And so waiting for somebody else, or assuming that you're going to do it yourself, that it's not the responsibility of other people who hold prejudices and stand in the way, that's an important thing to do, and that is a hard discussion to have. I know it's a hard discussion to have, but unlike a lot of things, I can remove obstacles. I can figure out how to hopefully figure out how to get it so everybody gets childcare. I could try to figure out a way that everybody gets opportunity to go to college equally. And you could list the things, and there are tangible obstacles, and you can say, money, time, I can fix this. But I can't fix what people feel with any legislation. And a lot of us think that when the civil rights legislation was passed, that this is the end of the story. And before that, people thought that when Lincoln freed the slaves, it was the end of the story. Or when you had the emancipation legislation after the Civil War, that was the end of the story. Americans know nothing about Reconstruction. They know nothing about what happened to black communities and black people during Reconstruction. And it was not the end of the story. There was no happy continuation after the end of the Civil War. Things did not get better. And in some places they got worse. In places like the South, they just put slavery into another name and continued to essentially practice the same thing. So these problems have been persistent, they're durable, and they're ingrained in the American psyche. And I know that a lot of people came over after the Civil War, and the unfortunate thing is the immigrants who came over, and my grandparents, families like mine, just slipped into whatever the norm of society was without really questioning. And this includes many people who fled oppression, didn't see the oppression when they got here. And that's part of adjusting to American culture, was part of who got favored and who didn't get favored. But we have a long, unsuccessful history of dealing with it, and I think we have an unsuccessful history of dealing with it because we can't talk about it. And you can't solve a problem if you can't discuss the problem. And so what we're trying to do is have these conversations with people to get them to think about it. And the way I try to frame it for folks is, obviously, I'm a white guy. It's pretty well established. And so things I've never thought about in my life, like, what does an interviewer think of me based on my race? What does the teacher think of me based on my race? What does the shopkeeper think of me based on my race? Anything I've done in my life, I've never thought about what it means to be white. I've never had to confront that. And then I ask people, so flip that and imagine you had to think about that every day. You're a kid walking down the street and somebody moves to the other side of the street. You're wondering, what does this person think about you? You walk into a store. People start being very interested what aisle you're going down and whether you're picking something up. Something no one ever questioned when I picked it up. You have to think about that. You walk into an interview. You got to think about what's the interviewer think. You're a student in a classroom. What does the interviewer think? I heard I was at WJ last night at the PTA event, and one of the women was talking about an incident in a school where this young black woman was in business class, and she told her mother that she felt the moment that she got into class, the teacher says, "What are you doing here?" As if she was there by mistake. And that's what the girl felt. Even if it wasn't intended, that's what she felt. And things like that are a problem. What we're going to try to do is touch the other part of our workforce and our community, which is not removing the obstacles part, because we're going to work on that. That's what social justice is about. That's what, diversity is about. We're going to be equal. We're going to remove the obstacles we can, but the biggest obstacle to racial justice in this country is internal, not external. And we've got to do the work to start addressing it. And Nancy's an eternal optimist. I would cast myself in the optimistic camp as well, so I wouldn't do this work if I wasn't an optimist. But it's not easy, because it's not a Montgomery County problem, it's a national problem. I think we all know this is actually, in the scale of places in the United States, this is one of the best places to be. And even in one of the best places to be, this persists. And so our job is to try to get deeper, to try to get under the skin, so to speak, and talk about this in a way that it's real for people, so that people like me think about it and begin to become conscious of it as we interact with other people. And one of the practical implications is when we do policies in Montgomery County, we want to think about impacts on the community. We need to be aware of that. And I don't know whether Art Williams is here, Pat Grant's here, but it was almost a year ago now, I guess. I was in a very intense discussion with them about our healthcare program, so the African American health program, and the notion of, I think all of us felt like, well, we do things equally. You have certain percentages of diabetes or hypertension in different communities. We try to distribute resources in a way that everybody gets their fair share of resources, the purpose of which is to extend people's life. And they said it's not equitable. And I said, but look, we're doing this. We went back and forth for about a half hour with kind of this one line back and forth. And at the end of it, one of them made the comment that, like African American lifespan of this county is about 7 years less than everybody else. If you address these problems, you're still not getting at one of the root problems, which is the social determinants of health, which isn't treated with metformin or lisinopril or any of the other drugs that deal with diabetes and hypertension. It's dealt with by something else. And so that's the place we've got to go, is to having these deeper conversations, because our workforce has to think about what we're doing, has to think about the people they're working with. Our residents have to think about this, and that's the way we get to move beyond this. So we're going to work very hard. Our folks are committed to this. I'm really glad everybody's here. There's a lot of work to do, but we've got the kind of community, I think, that can do this work. So I want to thank you all very much for coming out, and I look forward to the discussions for the rest of the evening.
I am with the County Council's Office of Legislative Oversight, and I've been asked to provide some background on a few key concepts regarding racial equity based on some reports we've done, as well as the work of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. So what do we mean by the term racial equity? So as noted in the slide above, racial equity refers to closing gaps in outcomes, so that race no longer predicts one's success, while also improving outcomes for all groups. So for example, in education, racial equity refers to closing opportunity gaps, so that neither suspensions nor graduation rates can be predicted by race or ethnicity, but at the same time improving outcomes for every subgroup. So to close gaps, the Government Alliance for Race and Equity recommends that local jurisdictions target their efforts on communities of color to target improvements among those most burdened by racial inequity. As our county executive already shared, it's really about focusing less on services and more on structures to really figure out what are the drivers of institutional racism in government decision making and to try to root those out. So this slide provides an overview of 3 national best practices for advancing racial equity and social justice that have been identified by GARE, the Government Alliance for Race and Equity. And this is based on their work in 150 plus jurisdictions across the country. And so the first set of best practices is to normalize conversations about race and racial equity. And so that's really a two-part, 2 strategies towards that. The first is to describe a racial equity framework and have conversations around race and normalizing it in terms of having a shared language and understanding of what we mean by race, racial equity, racism, equity, so be it. The other part of that, the other strategy for this best practice is to act with urgency and to understand that you need the community as well as decision makers to understand that this is something that is a priority and requires a commitment. The second set of best practices has to do with organizing resources for racial equity. And again, that's 2 strategies for that. The first is to organize your internal staff within government to work on racial equity. So that might be the use of racial equity teams, as well as our county executive mentioned, the county is in the process of hiring a racial equity director, a racial equity chief. Another part of that, and this community conversation today is emblematic of that, is to partner with communities, community-based organizations, residents, and particularly those who are impacted by racial disparities, because it's not just the partnerships within government, but it's the partnerships across a jurisdiction that are essential to doing this work. And then the final set of best practices is to operationalize for racial equity. And that refers really to 2 strategies. The first is the use of racial equity tools for decision making. And so that can be the use of tools to examine whether a policy decision or a budget decision is going to favorably or negatively impact racial disparities or ethnic disparities, and going through a process to either make sure that those decisions address inequities or at least minimize harm to communities of color. And then the second part of operationalizing for racial equity has to do with the use of data and making sure that you understand what the disparities are and what progress you're making towards that end. And as our council president mentioned, the Office of Legislative Oversight, through the direction of the county council, had a racial equity profile published and released about a month ago. That provides a baseline across a number of different policy areas of what our outcomes look like by race and ethnicity in the county. So this slide, also from GARE, finds that jurisdictions that implement best practices for advancing racial equity and social justice usually move along this continuum where they begin with diversity, move towards inclusion, and then hopefully focus on equity. And so for diversity, which is usually the first step, that's the inclusion of people of color in decision making. Oftentimes though, it might not occur in ways that are proportional to the groups that are being represented in decision making, and so it ends up being tokenism. Then other jurisdictions, as they sort of move from diversity to inclusion, they try to have more proportional inclusion of people of color in decision making, but if they're not actually in sort of senior level positions and able to actually inform the decision making, then it's not ideal. And then the final step towards a focus on equity is really when all of the decision makers are focused on how their decisions are impacting equity and that there's recognition that that's a priority. So this final slide that I'm going to share is fairly dense with a lot of data. This data is included in a report that we have up online. It's OLO report 2019-7. But essentially it gives you a sense of what the impact of institutional racism looks like in terms of disparities by race and ethnicity here in the county. So this data comes from the American Community Survey, And it shows that white and Asian and Black adults in the county generally have fairly high levels of high school completion. But you have Latinos that lag behind on that measure. When you look at rates of having a bachelor's degree or higher, you have 2/3 or more of white and Asian residents who meet that benchmark, but only 43% of Black residents and about 1/4 of Latino residents. When you look at labor force participation, it's actually higher among Blacks and Latinos in the county compared to white and Asian residents. But then when you look at unemployment rate, it's more than double for Black residents compared to white and Asian residents, and higher for Latino residents as well. Looking at median income, you see a very wide disparity where Black residents, their household incomes are about half of what white household incomes are. Again, another set of disparities when we look at home ownership, where about 3/4 of white and Asian residents own their homes compared to 43% of Black residents and a little less than half of Latino residents. And then again, very stark differences, disparities when we look at residents in poverty, with Black and Latinos overall being more than twice as likely as white residents and almost twice as likely as Asian residents to be in poverty. And then children in poverty, where you have Black and Latino children 5 to 6 times more likely than white children to be in poverty. So if it were differences in educational background or differences in labor force participation that were sort of the primary drivers of these disparities, you would envision narrower disparities. You envision more equality, or equality as a whole. So we offer this to give some context for what is occurring in the county, and to also sort of dispel the myth that everyone is doing equally well in Montgomery County. It is a prosperous county, and compared to other places, people of color, Blacks and Latinos are doing well, but when we look at opportunity overall, there's big gaps in Montgomery County as there are in other parts of the country. And so now I'm going to have my colleague Tiffany Ward give you some context for the small group work that you're going to be doing.
I'm Tiffany Ward. I'm the Racial Equity Program Manager for the county. I am going to be brief. I'm just the last person between you and these conversations, but I want to thank you guys for coming out tonight. What you're really doing is helping us normalize these conversations and organize around this so that we can then operationalize this work. So a little bit about the questions we're asking you to answer tonight. The first question is really an icebreaker. We'd appreciate if you would spend most of your time on the last 2 questions. There should be a scribe at your table, and they'll take down all the notes and then report it back to us. We have Leadership Montgomery here to help facilitate these conversations. I will introduce C. Marie Taylor, who will actually come up and give you guys kind of the lay of the land and how to do this and do it well, and so that it is actually productive. And I'm really excited. We have about, a half hour, 35 minutes or so for these conversations. And we'd like you to get to it. C. Marie Taylor.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. All right, so I'm going to whip through the ground rules and the logistics for this, and we're going to jump right into the conversation. And the questions are on your table, and they're going to stay on the screen. So here's what's going to happen. We have about 35 minutes for discussion, and then we're going to do report outs in an orderly fashion with kindness and clarity. That's why I'm here. Everyone say kindness and clarity. That's how we're going to talk to our neighbors, with kindness and clarity. I know it's late. Come on, get it together. All right, here's rule number 1. If your table is half full or homogeneous, get up and go find someone who does not look like you and sit next to them. I'm taking 10 seconds. Go. If it's half full, move. If it's homogeneous, move. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Clock is ticking. All right. Can everyone look this way? All right, we filled in our spots. Is everyone? We want to take 1 second to announce that Councilmember Tom Hucker from District 5 is here, so make sure we fill in that table. All right, so now that we're in non-homogeneous tables, do we have a scribe at every table? Is there a scribe at every table? Raise your hand if you're the scribe for your table. All right, so the other volunteer that we need is someone who's going to report out. So that could be the scribe or it could be somebody else. So who is going to be the person that's going to report out? Raise your hand.
So you gotta
Do it quietly. Do we have a reporter for each table? Yes? All right. So here's what's happening. Are we ready for the ground rules so we can keep going? If you can hear me, clap your hand once. If you can hear me, clap your hand twice. If you can hear me, clap your hand 3 times. All right, so here are the logistics. All right, we've got a scribe and a reporter. Here are the 3 questions. We're going to have 10 minutes or so for each question. We really want to focus on questions number 2 and 3. Are we ready for the ground rules? Yes, all right, here we go. You have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in proportion. All right? Talk as if you are right, but listen as if you are wrong. Did you hear that? Talk as if you are right, but listen as if you are wrong. Okay. When someone is speaking, look for the humanity in that person. We're going to have some courageous conversations, so find the humanity in the person that is speaking. Number 5, we're going to respect the group and their opinions and their lived experience. With that, we're going to listen to learn, and we're going to lean into the discomfort of the conversations. Okay? And this is really important, the last 2. We're going to be aware of the impact that we have with the statements that we make, because we're coming from our own lived experience. So be aware of the impact. And the last one I'm going to briefly talk about is we're having a courageous conversation, right, about race and racism. So when you're in a courageous conversation, it often lands in 4 different places. One of the places it can land for the person is in their beliefs or morals. So when I'm talking about racism, I might be in a space where I'm talking about my beliefs or my personal morals, right? But Tiffany might be in a space where she's thinking intellectually and thinking about the problem, trying to figure it out from an intellectual place, right? That's a different landing. Another person might be in their feelings and emotions, something that deeply impacted them. Or someone might be in the social or doing space. So there's 4 different spaces someone can be in. So when someone's speaking, we want to look at their eyebrows, we want to look at their eyes, we want to listen to the tone, and try to figure out what space they're in and meet them there. And again, respecting that process and their lived experience and staying in your belief zone, but lending yourself to move to a different one. Does that make sense for folks? Yes. All right, can we agree as a group, a large group, to abide by these ground rules? If so, say aye. Aye. If it's a nay, come sit next to me, and we'll talk together. I will listen to everything you say and not say a word. All right, so we're going to start off with question. Dana, come up, please, ma'am. So Dana is going to be our helpful timekeeper. This is Dana Polly, my colleague. So
Last time she said I was the main timekeeper, so I think I'm great.
because I'm speaking with kindness and clarity. All right, so we're going to start off with question number 1. What does racial equity matter? Thank you. Riff. Why does racial equity matter? So we're going to start discussing that and go. You have 10 minutes for this question.